in a socialist country. Did I give you a good example of a socialist country? Yeah, I had given you the old Soviet Union, and this is the place where I had basically mentioned, I believe, the race analogy. And if you remember the race analogy talking about the starting line versus the finish line, what do you remember about that, Ben?
That in socialism, referring to the Soviet Union, that everyone would, even though people might start at different places, everyone would end up at the same place.
Okay.
And with a laissez-faire, everyone might start at the same place, but could end up in different places on the line.
Was socialism the finish line like that closer to the start line?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. The race analogy, or the starting line, finish line, absolutely. In a socialist country, everybody would start at different places, but they would always finish at the same. And the thought would be, is that in a socialist country, if everybody's got the same TV, or the same toaster, or the same blue jeans, there would be no need for crime, because everybody's got the same thing as everybody else, so you wouldn't need to rob from somebody if you've already got it. And the sense was that the government would progressively wither away into nothing because you just didn't need it. Everybody was happy, goods were plenty. Problem was that finish line, that everybody finished at the same place, got closer and closer to the starting line. Goods weren't in plenty, and that caused problems. The other idea with the finish line, in the U.S., instead of focusing on the finish line, we would focus more on the start, so that maybe the government would provide everybody with, say, K through 12 education. And then you would be able to take that education as far as your ability and your motivation would go. So some people might take it a step, some people might take it a mile, but the bottom line was that you could go as far as you wanted, and then the state wasn't going to limit you. And then, of course, the last one up there, statism. And what was statism?
Nazis.
Yeah, low redistribution. And this was old Nazi Germany, high regulation. I think another statist country we talked about was also Japan. And this was where the death panel article started to come in. And the assisted suicide article began to come in as well. Because when you think about this, a couple of really, and the assisted suicide and the death panels could probably fall in with medical issues. So there are a number of questions that are, a general theme would be, okay, briefly explain, for example, how the government has handled medical or choice type issues. And maybe, you know, give me 3 or 4 examples of something along those lines. That could be a kind of a question that you would see. But make sure that you understand, in reference to assisted suicide, what the American policy is. It's not legal. So think about that. And then also, we talked to the idea about that husband and wife, where one of them had a debilitating disease and the other one didn't. Right. The death panels were kind of controversial. What was the death panel article? Because that's come up a couple of times now. People with dialysis. People with dialysis. What was the problem with the dialysis back then?
There was no treatment, and
it was like one machine.
There's no cure.
Okay, it was basically an experimental procedure, and it was incredibly expensive. So how did they divide up the resources? Did you say a team of evil?
Team of people.
Team of people. Okay, go ahead.
That decided whether or not you would be eligible.
What kinds of people were these?
One was a lawyer.
Priest.
Okay, one was a lawyer, priest.
Lawyer, 2 doctors, a housewife.
Make sure that you're clear with this, because there's a number of things in this article, and I think we kind of hit on this pretty good in class that day, but make sure you hit on this reasonably well. If you notice up here, it's talking about how these folks were known as the God Committee. And why were they known as the God Committee? What did they decide? That's right, you had the article, didn't you? Yeah, they basically decided who had the worth in order to gain the treatment based on limited resources.
And what they would try to find, was it your social worth they were looking for?
It was your social worth. And they had this, and as you mentioned here, the anonymous committee, a pastor, a lawyer, a union leader, a homemaker, 2 doctors, and a businessman. And it was based on social worth. So when you think about it, if you were too old, for example, they really weren't going to do anything in reference to this. If you were too young, for example, they weren't going to do anything with this. I mean, they basically looked at what your social worth was, or how you'd be able to contribute, say, to the country. So when you look at this, the reason that I gave you this in reference to talking about these 4 categories is here you've got the government getting involved. And they actually did a really good job as far as getting involved, because when they provided the funding, then all of a sudden the treatments kicked off. But when you read this article, the key is not the fact that the government got involved. The key is that the government had the resources to do it. And there's some sense that maybe those resources might not be there forever. based on our current budget situation. So give that one a good look over. Anything else from 3?
Under the Twitter thing on the outline where it says government, I don't even remember what that was all about.
Oh.
Yeah,
Under the
like-
Twitter thing in the
Yeah,
outline.
you talked about Iraq, like, against censorship, and, like, Twitter was their way to, like, say what they wanted to say
Mhm.
and not be censored.
But like right after Twitter, it says government, and it's not under it exactly, but it's under it, you know?
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Wasn't there an article about mortgages?
There is, and that was actually going to be the next thing I was going to mention was Rick Santelli, because there's a
Yeah.
link in there, and the mortgage example was actually an example of socialism. What was the quote that he said? What did he say that the government needed to be focused on? Do you remember? Santelli in that rant said that we needed to be focused on people that did a certain thing and not people that didn't do it.
Hey,
Yeah, we need to be, as a government, concerned about the people that carry the water instead of the people that are drinking it. And if you remember, he was basically suggesting in this, if the government is paying for these people that can't pay for their own mortgages, 1, this is really socialistic, and 2, we're focusing on the wrong folks. Instead of the people that can't pay, that overbought or whatever, they're drinking the water, we need to focus on the people that can actually carry it. This, you could argue, was socialism, but you could also argue it was what else? What did Hitler used to say? What did Hitler used to say in reference to the German people? Hitler used to say,
Master race?
if you are not adding to society,
You're taking away.
then you're actually taking away. And Hitler would routinely kill off these people that were basically using more resources than they were presenting. So with this in mind, you could argue that there's some socialism here. You could probably also argue that there's some statism here as well. That in a nutshell, though, I think is chapter 3. Looking just to make sure of this. Yeah, that's basically it for 3. Let's jump